The government uses the civil service machinery in order to produce favorable election results. In 1953, they successfully ousted the then Prime Minister Khwaja Nazimuddin. The military and civil establishment, after a while, they decide that the political process is really too much trouble. And it would be better just to seize power overtly. You have the rise of the Awami League. The Awami League goes on and eventually wins the elections, but the military refuses to accept the result and plunges the country into a civil war. General Zia had held even a somewhat free and fair election. The People's Party would have been swept back to power. Military leadership, as it presently stands, commands the implicit respect of a large segment of the population where it had that standing until just a few years ago. The PTI government was in its final year or so. Their popularity graph was going down. Basically, they transferred their victimhood narrative to the PTI. Yeah. And the PTI has a much more sophisticated digital outreach. We've seen this, since this government has come into existence, that it's literally one crisis after another, after another, after another. And, how long will this continue?
Hello and welcome to New Wave History audiences. This is Ali Warsi, your host, and I have Dr. Ilhan Niaz today with me, who is a professor of history at Quaid-e-Azam University. And these days we are watching the political parties in Pakistan, the government and the opposition, Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, having a dialogue between each other. We thought that they were locked in a fight to death, but gladly they are negotiating now. But some people, Dr. Saab, are still pessimistic about the outcome of this dialogue that the two parties are having, because they've seen so many dialogues fall apart in the history of Pakistan's political process. And how do you see, if you could give us a historical perspective of dialogues between governments and their respective oppositions from 1950s onwards, if you could give us some sort of a historical perspective so we can understand how grounded are the fears of certain people who are saying that these dialogues are also not going to work.
Okay, so the first thing is that in any system that claims to be democratic, dialogue is something that is always considered to be ongoing. So all political parties and political forces should be continuously engaging with each other and talking to each other and exchanging views with each other. The way in which a political outcome is secured is then after every few years, you have an election. And that election then produces a result. And that result, if it is credible, is then accepted by the winning party as well as by the losing party. And they agree then that after a set amount of time, there will be another election, 4 years, 5 years, whatever the term limit is. And then we will see who forms the next government. So the basic instrument of a political dialogue in a functioning political system is the electoral process and the dynamics that creates. In Pakistan, what we see is that starting in March 1951, this is during the first Muslim League government, the government uses the civil service machinery in order to produce favorable election results in a large number of constituencies. And these are provincial elections, and these provincial elections set the pattern that then all subsequent Pakistani elections have manifested, in which the winning party claims that the election was fantastic, the losing parties claim that the election was rigged, or in some cases, the parties that don't like the election results, they simply refuse to accept the result at all as legitimate. So in Pakistan, the basic mechanism for having a political dialogue in the country was aborted very early in the country's history. This then led to the rise of the civil service and the military as important political players. And in 1953, they successfully ousted the then Prime Minister Khwaja Nazimuddin. They then went on to dissolve the first Constituent Assembly just a few days before it was due to pass the final Constitution Bill. And they then created a coalition of frontmen, if you will, who would sit in the parliament and sit in the government, but would not actually have any real control over how the country was being run. So, from that perspective, if you are in the opposition, then who do you talk to? It does not make any sense to talk to the frontmen because they don't have any power. They're occupying offices, but they are not the ones who have political power. So then you have a crisis where the people who are formally in power, currently in the good books of the forces that have put them there, they seek to continue in government, and those that are opposed to them seek to oust them. How do they seek to oust them? They call for fresh elections, they stage protests, they stage civil disobedience, they have shows of strength to basically demonstrate that they are more popular than the people that are formally in the government.
Right.
They can also appeal to the judiciary for assistance depending upon the period we are looking at. So you have a permanent crisis that then emerges. Now, this crisis traditionally resolves itself in one of two ways, neither of which have proven very good as far as Pakistan is concerned. The first is that the power behind the throne, the military and civil establishment, after a while, they decide that the political process is really too much trouble and it would be better just to seize power overtly and establish direct authoritarian rule. Do away with the facade, if you will, and the frontmen and have a direct rule over the country. The other thing that, of course, happens is that in response to such maneuvers, people start to rise up in rebellion and in protest against those who are trying to impose this.
Right.
So you do not actually resolve the crisis, you merely change the dimensions of the crisis. So you try to put a lid on the political system, rule directly, as we saw, let's say, during the Ayub era. But at the end of the day, what happens? The streets explode in violence in 68, 69. Then you have the rise of the Awami League. The Awami League goes on and eventually wins the elections.
Exactly.
But the military refuses to accept the results and plunges the country into a civil war. So that is unfortunately what we have seen in our history, where the dialogue, if you will, doesn't really serve any constructive purpose because the actual power center is not really interested in a cooperative strategy. What they're looking is to basically co-opt political elements in order to provide some kind of a window dressing, if you will, to their unaccountable rule. So in that context, I think the real dialogue, if there is a dialogue that is to take place, wouldn't be between the PTI and the PMLN, though that can also take place at one level. The real dialogue would be between the PTI and the military, which are actually the two power centers that are at loggerheads. And I think that that dialogue would be a dialogue that is worth having because Pakistan is in a very, very dangerous situation where you have this prolonged public alienation from the state itself now creeping in, even in the Punjab and in KP. And the most popular party and the most powerful institution seem to be at loggerheads.
So
So,
what
so this
happens?
is a very, difficult sort of thing.
So what we've seen so far is that the establishment is currently unwilling to talk to the PTI, and or at least this is what they say, or vice versa. But at the same time, we are seeing some overtures by the government, and Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf is also responding to those overtures, and therefore there is a hope that they might be able to negotiate something, and then it may be approved by the establishment. But what if these negotiations fall apart and the military is not willing or ready to discuss directly with Imran Khan? What happens then? Do you see a parallel between 1970 and 2024 and 25?
I think there are some interesting parallels in the sense that in both of the cases, the most popular party was not allowed to form the government.
Yes.
But obviously, there are very important differences because the alienation that had crept into the eastern wing of the country during Ayub Khan's dictatorship, that was of a very different level and different intensity as compared to the alienation that you see today in Pakistan. So I think that was 1970 was a far more severe crisis in that respect. But there is a superficial resemblance.
Right.
Having said this, when we, let's say, look at the 1970s after the military takes over from the People's Party, the People's Party is undeniably the most popular party.
True.
If General Zia had held even a somewhat free and fair election, the People's Party would have been swept back to power.
Yes.
And that was a major reason why he kept martial law in place for a
8
good
years.
7-8 years.
Yes.
And even when martial law was lifted, it was a very partial sort of lifting of the martial law because you did not have organized political parties allowed back into the system. You had non-party based
Non-party
elections. So I think we should always sort of understand that the dialogue, if you will, that has to take place between those who have the popularity and those who have a certain amount of entrenched state power in our context. Whether they should have it or not is another issue.
Right.
So that is the type of dialogue that would be conducive to finding a way out. And obviously, for any dialogue to genuinely work, both sides would have to make substantive concessions. So I don't really see that likely to materialize in terms of the PTI or the current military leadership. Though, yes, maybe there can be some marginal normalization between the government and the PTI as an opposition in exchange for maybe lessening of repression, maybe, finally letting them have their reserved seats or something to that effect. But that would not change the fact that the government as presently constituted is a government that has emerged from an electoral process that is widely considered to have been one of the most heavily rigged in Pakistan's history.
Yes.
And in our history, that is saying quite a lot because unfortunately we have not had many, free and fair elections.
Do you see Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf being able to bring the establishment down to its knees? Do you think that this is possible in our particular situation?
I think one of the very important things that has happened over the past 5 or 6 years, especially, but let's say since 2022 in a very dramatic fashion, is that the Punjab and the settled districts of KP that basically are the social base of the armed forces
Yes.
of Pakistan, they are in favor of the PTI. So, in earlier confrontations between the military and other forces, the military could bank upon the social base that it had in this core region, if you will. That is now no longer the case. So the PTI has that demographic advantage working in its favor. Uh, so how that plays out is, of course, anyone's guess. But I don't think that the military leadership, as it presently stands, commands the implicit respect of a large segment of the population where it had that standing until just a few years ago. So we've seen this before as well, that the military has promoted certain proteges. Then, when the protege gets out of hand, they have intervened to cut them back down to size. Arguably, you can say this happened to Bhutto, this happened to Nawaz Sharif and Shahbaz Sharif. This is something which is happening arguably now as far as Imran Khan is concerned. But I think this time the demographic dynamics are a little bit different from what they were 5 or 10 years ago.
Right.
So that is something which the men behind closed doors need to have an eye on. And it's not enough to ban Twitter or to slow down the internet or to engage in this sort of ham-fisted repression of individual journalists or individuals who are saying X, Y, or Z. There has to be some serious thought that there is this very real demographic shift. Young people today have, in a way, seen their political expectations dashed in front of their eyes. They feel alienated and they blame the military and the military's allies for that alienation. So there are more votes to be had, if you will, in aligning yourself with that sense of alienation than in cooperating with the military. And this is something which we see happening earlier as well, that when the PTI government was in its final year or so, their popularity graph was going down.
Yes.
And the PMLN's popularity graph was increasing. So if there had been, I think, a free and fair election, a reasonably free and fair election on time in 2023,
Yes.
I am reasonably confident that you would have had the PMLN coming back to power, at least in the Punjab and maybe also at the center, without any serious question mark. But the fact that they chose to align with the establishment to then oust, so that basically they transferred their victimhood narrative to the PTI.
Yeah.
And the PTI has a much more sophisticated digital outreach. It has far more young supporters. So they've been able to leverage and magnify that to a very, very great degree.
So basically, the demographic is basically working against the army, even if whether you align them yourselves with the army or not, is going to determine whether you are going to be popular. And the alignment with the army is going to be inversely proportional with the popularity among the electorate, the public.
The political cost, let's say, of that alignment is going to go very high.
Yes.
And it seems to be escalating. So this is a situation which is unusual in the Pakistani context, because typically the party that can rely upon or lean on the establishment thinks that it has
The upper hand.
more support and has the upper hand in its dealings. But we've seen this, since this government has come into existence, that it's literally one crisis after another, after another, after another. And, how long will this continue?
Right. So thank you very much, Dr. Ilhan Niaz, for this incisive analysis, and I hope that people would have learned a lot. And I would again, at the end of the video, request my viewers to like the video, share it if you like it, and also subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. For now, this is it from Ali Warsi and New Wave History. See you again.